China, an ever-changing giant. Home of the world's oldest living civilization, this land was nearly stripped of its spiritual roots after 70 years of communist dogma. After the disastrous Cultural Revolution, the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, pretended to reform itself so it could attract foreign investment. Now it is done pretending. It's critical the world understand the regime's agenda, tactics, and how to deal with it, or we risk being caught underfoot by the imminent dangers it presents. The coronavirus outbreak is the latest wake-up call. Originating in China, the virus got out of control because the CCP hid it and lied about it.
One of the first Chinese doctors who tried to warn the world about a new coronavirus died on Friday from the illness. He and 7 others were reprimanded by Wuhan police last month for spreading illegal and false information about the coronavirus.
For the regime, censoring information to maintain tight control is far more important than saving lives. This obsession with power has thrown the whole world into crisis.
European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen confirmed on Tuesday that the EU would be closing off its external borders to curb the spread of coronavirus.
The death toll from the coronavirus in Italy on Thursday overtook that of China, where the virus first emerged, making Italy's outbreak the deadliest in the world and now the epicenter of the pandemic. U.S. health experts fear the country is on a similar trajectory as Italy.
Total cases as of this morning in New York City, 21,873.
Criticism is growing over China's handling of the CCP virus outbreak.
And if people would have known about it, it could have been stopped in place. It could have been stopped right where it came from, China.
And the U.S. intelligence community has reportedly come to the conclusion that China's Communist Party purposely concealed their virus numbers from the start. U.S. Senator Ben Sasse, a member of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, put it plainly, quote, "The Chinese Communist Party has lied, is lying, and will continue to lie about coronavirus to protect the regime."
Can something worse happen? Maybe. What if it is not a pandemic that may eventually pass, but a fatal threat to our security, freedom, and way of life? To learn about the CCP's method of rule, let's look at the experience of Hong Kong, one of the world's great cities.
Hong Kong's Polytechnic University was in flames on Monday as police laid siege to the educational institution turned fortress.
It's 40 miles from communist China, the CCP, and they feel it.
President Xi Jinping made clear we firmly support Hong Kong police in strict and rigorous enforcement of law.
Don't test our bottom line. And if we have to respond, I believe the only option is to use deadly weapon.
It looked like they were going to run over some patriots. He's got the M16s ready to shoot, ready to fire.
Police just use the gun to shoot us, and there is the rule is that all the people want to escape.
They don't have the warrior culture here. They're super peaceful here. Generally, they like to go to school, make money, that sort of thing. Super civilized.
Hong Kong was once one of us, free and vibrant. It shared the core values of other liberal democracies. But after the handover, its freedoms have come under the CCP's constant encroachment.
Hong Kong is different from a lot of the fights going on in the world. It is the large majority of all of Hong Kongers fighting against communist China, really, in the end.
We are fighting for freedom and survival, okay? And the world should know, if Hong Kong falls, the whole world falls, okay? Because the Chinese Communist Party is the existential risk of humanity, period.
The CCP wants to remake Hong Kong in its own image, and its appetite is not limited to that.
PRC, the regime in Beijing, is the most evil regime, if we leave aside the Soviet Union, since the Third Reich.
The difference is that the Soviet Union and Third Reich didn't dominate critical global supply chains, including those providing life-saving medicine.
In 5 to 10 years, we'll have virtually no manufacturing capacity left for generic drugs. And again, this is 90% of our medicines. Chinese companies formed a cartel, dumped it on the global market, and they drove out all the US, European, and even Indian producers. This was in the early 2000s. And once they gained dominant market share, prices went back up.
What we've seen is not that China has become more like the rest of the world and that it's liberalized. We've seen it go the other way.
The European countries have been naive about China for too long. It is a different system. And there is a risk that a different system tries to impose its system on other parts of the world.
Before we realized it, the CCP had a death grip on our economy and had infiltrated our institutions.
From the party's great firewall in cyberspace, or to that great wall of sand in the South China Sea.
More repression, more unfair competition, more predatory economic practices, indeed a more aggressive military posture as well.
If we do not meet this threat now, it's going to define our century in much the same way that the Soviet Union defined the last century.
Learn from the Hong Kong experience, because we have been dealing with this giant for at least 22 years. We have what has been happening on the ground to illustrate and to demonstrate to you how the CCP can go about taking over all these institutions and values.
In 1984, the CCP made a promise to the world. One country, two systems. Hong Kong people ruling Hong Kong.
In 1984 or before that, during the Sino-British Joint Declaration, most people were really afraid of the Chinese Communist Party. And then the strong man Deng Xiaoping, he understood that. He said, yes, Hong Kong will be handed back to China in 1997. But don't be scared, because the communists are not going to come and run Hong Kong. Why? Because you will have one country, two systems. One for the mainland, one for Hong Kong. So you will have your capitalist system, your freedoms, your rule of law, your personal safety for 50 years after 1997 until 2047.
就说50年不变了，50年之后更没变的道理。对。
Now, Hong Kong people are to run Hong Kong. That is the promise, and that is the unshakable destiny.
To the CCP, Hong Kong is a mixed blessing. It is crucial for China's international trade and foreign capital raising. But its aroma of freedom and persisting memories of the CCP's brutalities are considered poisonous to the CCP's ruling of mainland China. In 2003, 6 years after the handover, Beijing tried to pass Article 23, an anti-sedition law, in Hong Kong. It would let the party arrest commemorators, as well as free thinkers, people of faith, and political activists, all in the name of national security.
Well, I think the Chinese government feels that they really need to come in and have very tight control. So, I mean, they have for decades, even before 1997, infiltrated Hong Kong. Their party members have infiltrated the government, the universities, business, and professionals.
In 2012, the regime tried to implement a national education curriculum that glorifies the party and teaches its version of history.
現在國民教育最大嘅被批評嘅地方就係洗腦。
因為國民教育科係中國定出嚟嘅歷史，唔係真正嘅歷史。
The regime intensified media controls in Hong Kong in 2013 and 2014. Journalists were stabbed and beaten by triads linked to the regime. Vandalism, physical attacks, and financial interference became common.
The basic law promises press freedom, but in reality, it is being significantly compromised. Interviews were barred, finished pages were removed, photos were added, columnists were sacked.
This is the worst time. I think most of mainstream media are self-regulated and self-censorship.
You also see that the Hong Kong media has been either bought up or controlled by the Chinese capital.
In August 2014, Beijing laid down strict limits on promised voting reforms in Hong Kong. All candidates would be approved by the regime. For Hong Kongers, it meant the death of their democratic dream.
What we want is the right to elect our leaders so that our leaders have a genuine mandate to govern Hong Kong. This will improve governance. We also want to see Hong Kong people having a genuine choice in electing their leaders and no screening mechanism.
Beijing is reneging upon promises made in 1997 and also promises made to Britain that Hong Kong can retain a high degree of autonomy.
It's been a month since pro-democracy protests erupted in Hong Kong, and these umbrellas have become a symbol of the movement.
In November 2016, China's top legislature interfered in an ongoing politically charged court case by issuing an interpretation of Hong Kong's basic law. This led to the disqualification of 2 elected members of Hong Kong's Legislative Council.
China's parliament recently made a rare interpretation of Hong Kong's mini-constitution, rebooting fears that Beijing is tightening its grip on Hong Kong's unique political process.
It was unnecessary and would do more harm than good to public perception of the continued respect for the rule of law in Hong Kong.
In a stunning move, on the eve of the 20th anniversary of the handover of Hong Kong, the Chinese regime betrayed the pledge that Hong Kong's return was founded upon.
中英联合声明作为一个历史文件，已经不再具有任何现实意义。对中国中央政府对香港特区的管理也不具备任何约束力。英方对回归后的香港没有主权、没有治权，也没有监督权。
In 2019, under Beijing's urging, Hong Kong's chief executive tried to push a bill that would allow the extradition of Hong Kong residents and visitors to China.
Over the 22 years after reversion of sovereignty in 1997, there have been time and again many breaches of the basic law, but not as seriously as on this occasion when they tried to send us back to stand trial in the mainland.
This is a very important piece of legislation that will help to uphold justice.
It would allow for the extradition of basically anyone that Beijing doesn't like.
There, those extradited would be subject to the CCP's judicial system, which remains an instrument of control for the regime.
Massive Hong Kong protests broke into clashes with police Wednesday as riot officers let off rubber bullets and streams of tear gas.
You shoot the journalists! It's still Hong Kong, not China.
You can say that this is the last straw off the camel's back, which triggers a very deep awakening on the part of Hong Kong people, because it affects every person who is physically in Hong Kong, including even foreigners.
As happened before in China and Hong Kong, triad members seem to act on the regime's orders, attacking citizens and instilling terror.
Hong Kong's political crisis has taken a violent new turn. This graphic footage came from a reporter who live streamed the attack at a rural train station Sunday night. After weeks of clashes between demonstrators and police, the spotlight has shifted to the territory's shadowy criminal network. Authorities say 45 people were injured in the attacks, with one in critical condition.
Witnesses said police left Yuen Long Station when the violence started and then never responded to repeated calls for help.
前後起碼超過1個幾鐘頭。我對於警方係完全冇派人去嘗試控制個局面呢，係表示極度憤怒。
More than apparent collusion between the police and the triads in that neighborhood, inexplicable. And the idea seems to be one of to shock, to awe, to terrorize.
The terror rose further when police began random beatings.
我見到嘅係有警察嚟嗰一下，每個人都好驚警察，竟然係點解佢哋嚟咗往中環呢個車卡去襲擊我哋？然後佢係冇行過嚟問你係邊個啊，都冇做過任何佢去詢問嘅過程，佢就係拎住佢支棍，拎住胡椒噴霧打人、襲擊人、噴人。一班應該要保護緊香港市民嘅人，最後令到香港市民受傷嘅人，點解會係一啲要保護我哋嘅人去令到我哋受傷呢？
香港嘅警察咧係採取咗一個新嘅方法，所謂止暴制亂，就係咩咧？叫做震懾效應。震懾效應係咩咧？佢唔介意俾傳媒影到佢哋呢啲過分極端嘅鎮暴手法，佢調翻轉佢係要你影到添，然後同時通過呢啲嘅社交媒體啊或者電視台嘅畫面嘅傳播咧，係震懾咗大家唔出嚟，特別係針對咧越後生嘅所採取嘅手法越極端。其實而家直接指揮緊香港警察嘅應該唔係林鄭月娥，咁我相信就係呢個所謂政法委啦、國安公安嘅系統指揮緊香港警察，所以先至會咧係用一種更暴力、更兇狠嘅方式去鎮壓呢個香港嘅示威。
One protester was shot by an officer at close range, leaving him bleeding and howling on the ground.
Police in Hong Kong opened fire on anti-government protesters Monday morning. Local media report at least one person was hit. Video footage showed a protester lying in a pool of blood, his eyes wide open.
This week was the first time officers used force on campus grounds. For hours, they fired a barrage of tear gas, rubber bullets, and water cannon.
On university campuses across Hong Kong, thousands of students dug in on Thursday. Surrounded by piles of food, bricks, petrol bombs and other homemade weapons, they're waiting for what happens next amid the city's escalating violence.
Clashes between Hong Kong police and protesters have continued to escalate over the weekend. The city's Polytechnic University has now become the epicenter.
Hundreds of protesters are still holed up at the Polytechnic University in Hong Kong after an intense two-day confrontation with police. Arrests have been made throughout the day as anyone who tried to leave the university was either pushed back by tear gas or arrested immediately.
Some left through daring escape attempts. For those who have escaped, Hong Kong's police has a message.
Let me tell you this, you can run, but you cannot run forever. Just like the day before, a man that was identified by us has been arrested. Criminals that have escaped will eventually be captured.
香港保安局局长李家超公布了警方统计的数据，指今年从6月到9月的自杀案件共有256宗，比2018年同期多出34起，而发现尸体案件为2537宗，比去年增加311件。
Many of the victims are young protesters with questionable details surrounding their deaths. Christy Chan was last seen in late September on her school campus. After she went missing for 3 days, her naked body was found at sea. Police dismissed critics' claims that Chan died at the hands of the police force, saying there was nothing suspicious about the teen's death, calling it a suicide.
之前，一名蒙面港警在接受韩国媒体采访的时候，披露多个警报内幕，包括陈彦霖浮尸案、721元朗恐襲案，以及警察涉嫌強姦示威者等個案。
好似啱所講，因為全裸嘅浮屍太少見啦，實在。
即係一開始其實警察內部係懷疑係謀殺，跟住之後向公眾公開嗰陣就話係屍體發現咁樣。
佢內部淨轉埋嗰個調查方向轉喺度屍體發現啦，即係禁止內部以謀殺方向去調查。
民眾能夠普遍能夠感受到這種自殺是不尋常的，而且是年輕人，有的是撈起來都是背包，就是他的打扮都是黑衣服，勇武的那種打扮，那人們普遍感覺到恐懼襲來，感覺到中共讓你意會到這是中共幹的，他故意讓你意會到是中共幹的，但是沒有證據，警察說沒可疑，但是他也讓你感覺到這裡的很多破綻，就是說不是一單兩單，是這個時候密集發生的這些事情。
So we're here at the Epoch Times print shop in Hong Kong. Just this morning, 4 masked men entered the print store at about 3:30 a.m. with gasoline cans and actually threw gasoline down on the floor and actually lit the print shop on fire, either in an attempt to burn the whole place down or as a threat to the people working in here. The Epoch Times is one of the only Chinese language papers and papers around the world who report very accurately with an in-depth knowledge of the Chinese Communist Party.
攻击印刷厂那一天呢，11月19号也是大举案发表九评共产党社论的15周年的日子。大举案的九评共产党社论呢，触发了中国大陆的一场精神运动，就是退党潮。现在目前超过3亿的民众，中国民众用化名的方式退出中国共产党的这个相关组织。那中國共產黨對大紀元的這種恐懼和這種憎恨啊，就不言而喻啦，都看得到。
我哋可能5年前雨傘運動嗰時仲會講緊話冇激嬲共產黨咁樣，但係其實經過5年之後，當香港人發現其實呢一切嘢嘅幕後黑手係中國共產黨嘅時候，香港人已經好勇敢，可以企出嚟話：我哋依家就係要面對共產黨，要面對中共呢一個政權。咁我諗呢個已經唔單單只係某部分抗爭者嘅民意。而係大部分香港人嘅覺醒。
有冇諗過今日好唔好？我冇驚過，出得嚟行就預咗呢啲嘢。冇，但係我同我啲 friend 講咗話，要遺書㗎，即係講晒遺言㗎啦。咩嚟㗎？講唔講得㗎？講得啊！即係總之，如果我真係有咩三長兩短嘅，咪為見到我嘅浮屍啊乜嘢嘅。攞去器官捐贈咯，捐下啲有需要嘅人咯。次次出嚟死就預咗死㗎啦，講真句。但係不過冇辦法啦，為香港一定要贏㗎呢場仗。
A lot of the people I spoke with, I asked them, I'm like, hey, the CCP is very intolerant, very inflexible, and they're not likely to grant those 5 demands. How long are you willing to fight for those 5 demands? And almost everyone I asked to, dozens of people, they said one of 2 things: until I die or until they're met.
香港人能夠咁不怕死，走在世界嘅前線對抗嗰個極權，係因為我哋唔係中國人咁樣喜歡做奴隸，我哋唔做奴隸，我哋就係講俾政權聽，我哋係唔會屈服嘅，我哋係站喺個前線咧，係對抗呢個龐大嘅鎮壓共產機器。
我哋係無路可逃，我哋諗住死，我哋不如就繼續抗爭落去。民不畏死，奈何以懼之？
Well, I've seen other conflicts, whether it's Nepal or Afghanistan, Iraq, Philippines, Thailand, quite a lot years, and this is the only one that I've seen that amounts to Poland on the geopolitical gravity of this situation. Poland was the last straw for the Soviet Union, and now Hong Kong is that nexus of problems for CCP. This is an existential threat to CCP.
The CCP has made many promises. In 1944, Chairman Mao told the visiting U.S. Army Observation Group, "The U.S. is our good friend, and the Chinese Communist Party's goal is to establish an American-style democracy for Chinese people."
The American officers spent a year in Yan'an assessing the communist organization and their military potential. With full U.S. government approval, the Americans instructed the communists on strategy and weaponry.
I think at the time that they were a democratic force, that they were a popular force, and they had a popular support.
5 years later, the CCP ruled China. Soon, Chinese soldiers were fighting U.S. soldiers in Korea and Vietnam, where over 95,000 U.S. soldiers lost their lives. Chinese people suffered far worse. Since the CCP took power, 80 million people have died from its policies and political campaigns. Despite its ongoing brutalities, in 2001, the CCP was granted entry to the World Trade Organization with the promises of reducing trade barriers, opening up markets, protecting intellectual property rights, reforming its legal system, and respecting human rights. A decade later, the U.S. Congress examined the CCP's compliance with its promises.
Judging by the expressions of the past 10 years, I think the answer to the first question, whether China has and will keep its promises, is sadly no.
Not only did WTO not bring freedom and democracy to China, it so certainly didn't bring fair trade either.
Given its size and economic influence, China's refusal to abide by many of its WTO commitments not only harms the U.S. and third country economic interests, but threatens to undermine the legitimacy of the WTO and the international rules-based trading system.
Thanks to the CCP's entry to the WTO, it now has a global chokehold on the manufacturing of medicines and medical supplies. In early March 2020, in the midst of the coronavirus crisis, China's state-run Xinhua news agency published an editorial targeting the U.S.
Is the Chinese regime preparing to blackmail the U.S. over pharmaceuticals? The Communist Party is hinting it could withhold face masks and medical supplies from the U.S. as a form of leverage on other issues. The coronavirus pandemic is highlighting America's deep dependence on China for medical supplies.
Since 2013, many countries have been enticed by the CCP's Belt Road Initiative, a global infrastructure development and investment strategy.
China has positioned itself as an advocate of globalization and says its policies help the developing world.
The aim of building the Belt and Road is to work together to face the risks and challenges facing mankind, realizing win-win cooperation and development together.
Over 60 countries in Asia, Europe, Africa, and South America have bought into this vision.
中越两国政府关于共同推进丝绸之路经济带和21世纪海上丝绸之路建设的谅解备忘录。
I strongly support President Xi's ambition to have mutually beneficial free trade agreements in place.
The BRI initiative is something that will benefit the region and the world at large for decades and probably millenniums to come.
However, as the truth of these glowing promises was gradually unveiled, enthusiasm dwindled.
Die Forderungen der Europäischen Unionsländer, solche Stichworte wie freien Handel, Level Playing Field, gleiche Bedingungen aufzunehmen, dass diesen Forderungen nicht nachgekommen wurde.
Critics of Belt and Road say it traps some poor countries with debt that could put their sovereignty at risk.
These Chinese institutions are lending to countries often with very opaque agreements that no one knows the terms of until there's a bankruptcy or a failure to deliver, to pay back the terms of the loans, often with corruption taking place and outright bribery of local officials for projects of dubious merit that don't use local workers or local materials, but really are almost at the exclusive advantage of Chinese lending institutions, Chinese industrial overcapacity, Chinese labor access, with ultimate Chinese political control strategies and objectives over many parts of the world.
Do not accept foreign debt that could compromise your sovereignty. Protect your interests, preserve your independence, and just like America, always put your country first.
With its growing clout, the CCP has bared its claws. From its military expansion abroad to its control of more UN organizations, from its infiltration and coercion of international businesses, universities, news media, movie studios, and governments, to its public assaults on organizations and individuals who dare to criticize it, the CCP is attacking the vital organs of the free world, like a political incarnation of the deadly coronavirus.
They're using our institutions and our norms and our values against us in ways that we hadn't necessarily envisioned towards their own authoritarian agenda.
This is part of a persistent effort by Beijing to rework the international order to its advantage.
So I was telling our friends in liberal democracies that if you do not try to rectify this now, given, say, a decade more, you will find yourself to be completely helpless and you will be at CCP's mercy. If you do not act now, what Hong Kong experienced and went through in the freedom movement during the last 6 months could easily be your fate in the future. So it is, to put it shortly, today's Hong Kong can be the world's tomorrow if you do not act now.